What German High Command said. When they realized the Blitz had failed cold open. The leather portfolio landed on Hermann Göring's desk with a dull slap that echoed through the cavernous office at Carinhall. Outside, November rain clattered against the hunting lodge's tall windows. Inside, the Reichsmarschall's fingers paused over the breakfast tray, venison, pastries, 3 different jams, and remained still. The intelligence officer who'd delivered the report stood rigid near the doorway, rain still beating on his uniform collar. He'd driven through the night from Berlin. His face had the gray, sleepless quality of a man who'd spent hours verifying numbers he desperately wished were wrong. Göring didn't open the portfolio immediately. He lit a cigarette instead, the flame from his gold lighter casting brief shadows across his jowls. The room smelled of wood smoke and furniture polish and something else, the faint chemical tang of developing photographic film that had seeped into the leather binding. British industrial output, the officer said quietly, September through October, verified through reconnaissance overflights and signals intelligence. The Reichsmarschall opened the portfolio. The first page contained a single typed paragraph in a column of figures. Göring read it once, then again. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The cigarette burned forgotten between his thick fingers. Outside, the rain intensified. Somewhere in the forest beyond Carinhall's grounds, a hunting dog barked. Aircraft production, Göring said finally. His voice was flat. They're making more aircraft than they were in August. Yes, Herr Reichsmarschall. And tank production? Up 17%. Göring closed the portfolio and sat very still. Through 4 months of bombing, through hundreds of sorties over London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Britain's factories had not faltered. They had accelerated. The question that had been gnawing at the edges of Luftwaffe planning for weeks now crystallized into something undeniable. What if they'd been bombing the wrong target all along? Context. The promise. 4 months earlier, on a sweltering July afternoon in 1940, the mood inside the Reich Chancellery had been entirely different. Hermann Göring had stood before a map of England, pointer in hand, and made Adolf Hitler a promise. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had fled Dunkirk in chaos. Now, only the English Channel stood between Wehrmacht divisions and final victory in the West. The Luftwaffe, Göring insisted, would break British resistance from the air. "Give me 4 weeks," he'd said, "and the RAF will be finished." Hitler had listened with his arms folded, skeptical but intrigued. He preferred negotiated peace to an amphibious invasion. Operation Sea Lion felt risky, logistically nightmarish. But Göring's confidence was intoxicating. The Reichsmarschall spoke in absolutes. He cited tonnage of bombs. He referenced the Ibane terror bombing of Rotterdam. He painted a picture of London burning, of British morale collapsing, of Churchill's government suing for peace before autumn. General Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, had shifted uncomfortably during the presentation. He'd seen the reconnaissance photos of British fighter production. The numbers troubled him. But Göring had waved away such concerns. "Once we destroy their fighter bases," he'd declared, "production won't matter. You can't fly planes without pilots or airfields." By August, the Luftwaffe had launched Adlertag, Eagle Day, targeting RAF airfields across southern England. For 2 weeks, the strategy seemed to work. British fighter squadrons bled pilots, airfields cratered, radio stations went silent. The RAF was down to its last reserves. Then came September 7th. In retaliation for a RAF raid on Berlin, Hitler had ordered a shift in targets. No more airfields. Hit the cities, break civilian morale, make the British people beg Churchill to surrender. Göring had embraced the order with enthusiasm. He'd never really believed in the airfield strategy anyway. Too slow, too precise. Terror bombing was simpler, more dramatic, more Wagnerian. On the afternoon of September 7th, he'd stood on the cliffs of Cap Blanc-Nez, watching wave after wave of bombers cross toward London, and proclaimed to the staff officers around him, "This is the beginning of the end for England." London burned that night, and the next, and the next. The Blitz, the lightning war from the air, had begun. But now, in mid-November, standing in his office with rain drumming the windows and a leather portfolio full of impossible numbers on his desk, Hermann Göring, faced a truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. London was still standing. Britain was still fighting. And worst of all, their factories were outproducing Germany's. He crushed out his cigarette and reached for the telephone. The reckoning. By noon on November 12, 1940, 3 men sat in a secure conference room beneath the Reich Chancellery. The room was windowless, lit by harsh electric bulbs that turned everyone's skin sallow. A map of Britain covered one wall. Red pins marked bombing targets. Blue pins marked estimated damage. There were far too many blue pins still standing. Göring arrived last, his uniform immaculate despite the cold rain outside. He carried the intelligence portfolio under one arm. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of Luftflotte II, was already seated, thumbing through his own copy of the production report. Beside him sat Colonel Joseph Beppo Schmid, chief of Luftwaffe intelligence, looking like a man awaiting execution. Göring sat heavily and lit another cigarette. "Gentlemen," he said, "explain to me how the British are building more Spitfires now than they were before we started bombing them." Kesselring spoke first, his voice careful. "The dispersal program. When we shifted from military to civilian targets, they moved production. Underground. Small workshops, shadow factories. Our reconnaissance missed them. For 2 months. The cloud cover over England has been—" "Don't talk to me about weather, Albert." Göring's voice remained soft, which somehow made it worse. "We've dropped 20,000 tons of high explosive on British cities. We've killed 15,000 civilians. We've burned entire neighborhoods, and their production goes up?" Schmid cleared his throat. "The targeting priorities may have been suboptimal." The room went very quiet. "Suboptimal," Göring repeated. "We believed," Schmid continued, his voice tight, "that concentrated urban bombing would create a cascade effect, destroy worker housing, collapse public morale, disrupt transportation. The logic was that factory workers who spent nights in bomb shelters couldn't work efficiently during the day. And they adapted, faster than we projected." Schmid pulled a sheaf of intercepted BBC transcripts from his briefcase. "They're running factories on night shifts, using the bombing hours for sleep. They've evacuated children, which actually stabilized adult morale rather than breaking it. And he hesitated. "They've turned the bombing into a propaganda victory. Churchill's giving speeches about British resilience. They're calling it the London can take it spirit." Göring's cigarette had burned down to his fingers. He stubbed it out with deliberate force. "So we gave them a unifying narrative." "In essence, yes." Kesselring leaned forward. "We could return to the August strategy, hit the fighter bases again, the radar stations. Methodical, surgical. The Führer won't allow it." Göring's voice was flat. "He wants London punished for bombing Berlin. He wants terror, not tactics." The 3 men sat in silence. Above them, in the Chancellery proper, Hitler was hosting a luncheon for Hungarian diplomats. The sound of a string quartet filtered faintly through the ceiling. "There's another issue," Schmid said quietly. "Casualty rates." Kesselring stiffened. "Our losses are within acceptable parameters. For now. But RAF Fighter Command is stronger than it was in August. They've had time to recover, to train new pilots. And now they know our tactics." Schmid laid out another document: loss ratios, sortie effectiveness, bomber attrition rates. "Every major raid costs us more aircraft than we can afford. The British are winning the mathematics." Göring stood abruptly and walked to the map. He stared at the red pins clustered over London, over Coventry, over Birmingham, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of bravado. "We bombed them to break their spirit," he said. "We didn't bomb them to stop them from building Spitfires. We bombed them because we thought they would give up." No one replied. "The Führer believed," Göring continued, still facing the map, "that the British were decadent, weak, that a few nights of fire would send them running to the negotiating table." He turned. "We all believed it." Kesselring shifted in his chair. The strategic situation," Göring interrupted, "is that we attacked the wrong target. We thought we were bombing factories and homes. We were actually bombing an idea, and you cannot kill an idea with high explosive." The Reichsmarschall returned to his seat and began gathering the reports. His movements were slow, deliberate. Sea Lion is cancelled, has been for weeks, though the Führer won't say so officially. The invasion barges have already been dispersed. Winter's coming, and the British—" He tapped the production figures. "The British are building more planes, more tanks, more everything, while we burn through fuel and aircraft trying to terrorize them into submission." Schmid's voice was barely audible. "What do we tell the Führer?" Göring lit another cigarette and didn't answer immediately. Smoke coiled toward the ceiling. "We tell him the British industrial capacity has proven more resilient than anticipated. We tell him continued strategic bombing will attrite their civilian morale over time. We tell him anything that doesn't sound like 'we failed.'" "And the truth?" Kesselring asked. Göring met his eyes. "The truth is that we don't understand the British at all. We thought they were like us, that fear would make them rational. But there's something else. He trailed off, searching for words. "They're stubborn. Unreasonably stubborn. They should have surrendered in June after Dunkirk. They should have negotiated after France fell. They should have broken after London burned, but they won't. And I don't think more bombs will change that." He stood, signaling the meeting's end. "Continue the raids, maintain pressure, but start planning for the Eastern campaign. Because the British war isn't ending, and the Führer's attention is already turning toward Moscow." The three men filed out in silence, leaving the map on the wall with its pins and promises. The shockwaves that evening in a smoky Luftwaffe officers' club in Calais. Major Heinz Knock sat with two other bomber pilots and worked through a bottle of schnapps. None of them were drunk. You couldn't afford to be drunk when you might fly the next morning, but the alcohol took the edge off the exhaustion. "They're moving us east," Knock said quietly. "Heard it from my group commander. Spring 41, maybe sooner." His wingman, a thin Austrian named Bauer, frowned. "East? Yugoslavia?" "Russia." The word hung in the cigarette smoke. Bauer laughed nervously. "That's insane. We haven't finished England." "England's finished," Knock said. "Just nobody told England yet." Across the channel, in a basement flat in Stepney, Mary Foster swept broken glass from her kitchen floor for the third time that week. The air raid had ended an hour ago. The all clear had sounded. Her hands shook, but they always shook after raids now, part of her body's routine, like breathing. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, appeared in the doorway with a kettle of tea. "You all right, love?" "Fine. Windows again. Jerry's getting sloppy. Half those bombs landed in the river last night." Mary set down the dustpan and accepted the tea. Her hands steadied slightly around the warm cup. On the wireless, a BBC announcer was reading production figures. British aircraft output had exceeded Germany's for the second straight month. Mrs. Chen smiled grimly. "We're beating the bastards at their own game." Mary thought about her brother, a mechanic at the supermarine factory in Southampton. He worked 16-hour shifts now, lived in a cottage near the plant, slept through raids because he was too exhausted to care. The Germans had bombed the factory twice. Both times production had resumed within days. "They thought we'd run," Mary said quietly. "They don't know us very well, do they?" In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels read the same intercepted BBC broadcast in his propaganda ministry office and underlined the production figures in red ink. The British were bragging about their industrial output, turning it into a point of national pride. He'd seen the intelligence reports, knew the truth. The Blitz had backfired spectacularly, but he couldn't say that publicly. Instead, he drafted a radio address emphasizing German strength, Luftwaffe bravery, the inevitability of British collapse. The lies came easily now. He'd been lying about the British for months, claiming fighter command was destroyed, claiming British morale was breaking, claiming victory was imminent. The problem was that some people in the Reich actually believed him. Göring didn't. Kesselring didn't. But the Führer did, or at least wanted to, and that was more dangerous than any bomb. Goebbels finished the draft and handed it to his secretary. "Broadcast tonight, and find me positive stories about the Eastern Front preparations. We need to shift the narrative." In London, Winston Churchill sat in his underground war rooms, cigar smoke heavy around him, and read the latest decrypt from Bletchley Park. German bomber units were being pulled from France, redeployed eastward. The Luftwaffe High Command was losing faith in the Blitz. Churchill allowed himself a rare smile. The British had absorbed everything Hitler could throw at them and remained standing. More than standing, thriving. Factory output was climbing. American aid was increasing. The RAF was stronger than ever. The Germans had tried to break British will, and instead had hardened it into something unbreakable. They didn't understand, Churchill murmured to General Ismay, his chief of staff, that you cannot defeat an island people by making them angry. Ismay nodded. The raids will continue, though. Oh yes, Hitler can't admit failure. He'll keep bombing us until he finds something else to bomb. Churchill relit his cigar. But the strategic threat is over. They've lost this battle. They just don't know it yet. Do we tell the public? Churchill considered this. No. Let them think the danger continues. Fear keeps them sharp. Pride keeps them working. Together, that combination wins wars. The meaning. The failure of the Blitz revealed something fundamental about the nature of strategic bombing, something that would haunt military planners for decades. Terror works only when the enemy shares your psychology. The Germans, having watched their own civilians panic during isolated World War I air raids, believed that sustained bombing would shatter British morale. They projected their own fears onto an enemy they fundamentally misunderstood. British society, shaped by centuries of island defense, reacted not with collapse but with defiance. The Blitz didn't break Britain. It unified it. Göring's miscalculation was assuming that industrial output and civilian morale were fragile, interconnected systems that would cascade into failure under pressure. Instead, the British demonstrated that a decentralized economy, combined with a population genuinely invested in survival, could absorb extraordinary punishment and adapt. Factories dispersed, workers improvised, communities self-organized. The strategic lesson was clear. Bombing civilians doesn't win wars against nations that believe they're fighting for survival. It only makes them harder to defeat. But the lesson came too late for the Luftwaffe. By November 1940, the window for invasion had closed. Winter was coming, and Hitler's gaze was turning east toward the vast territories of the Soviet Union, where a different kind of war awaited, a war that would consume the Wehrmacht entirely. The Blitz would continue sporadically until May 1941, but its strategic purpose had already evaporated. It became a habit, a reflex, a way of demonstrating German power without actually wielding it effectively. The Luftwaffe went through the motions, dropping bombs on cities that no longer feared them as much as they hated them. German High Command never formally acknowledged the failure. There was no memo declaring, "The Blitz has not achieved its objectives." Instead, resources quietly shifted. Bomber groups received reassignment orders. Pilots heard rumors of the Eastern Front. The entire apparatus of the campaign simply redirected. But in private conversations, in officers' clubs and secure conference rooms, the truth circulated. They'd tried to bomb Britain into submission and failed. The British hadn't broken. They'd learned to live under fire, and that made them, in a way, invincible. The miscalculation would echo through the rest of the war, in the Allied firebombing of German cities, in the debates over Dresden and Hamburg, in the eventual atomic strikes on Japan. The question of whether bombing civilians could ever shorten a war would be asked again and again, each time with more terrible weapons and more catastrophic results. But the Blitz had already provided an answer. Not if the enemy refuses to quit. Not if their anger outweighs their fear. Not if you give them a reason to hate you more than they fear death. Closing. On November 19, 1940, a week after the conference beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hermann Göring stood alone in his private study at Carinhall. Outside, the first snow of winter was falling. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth. He held a glass of cognac and stared at a painting on the wall, a Vermeer, looted from a Dutch collection, showing a young woman reading a letter by window light. The room was quiet except for the fire and the faint ticking of an antique clock. The intelligence report sat on his desk, read and reread. British production climbing, RAF strength increasing, civilian morale unshaken, all the promises he'd made to Hitler in July now exposed as wishful thinking. He'd told himself he was breaking Britain. He'd believed it even. The psychological warfare, the terror tactics, the massive firepower. It should have worked. It would have worked against any rational enemy. But the British, it turned out, weren't rational. They were something else, something Göring, for all his medals and victories, had failed to account for. They were a people who'd made peace with the possibility of losing everything and decided to fight anyway. He finished the cognac in one long swallow. Tomorrow he'd meet with the Führer and discuss the Eastern campaign. New targets, new promises, new maps with different colored pins. The Blitz would fade into one more footnote in a war that was growing beyond anyone's control. But tonight, alone with the snow and the fire and the stolen painting, Hermann Göring allowed himself a moment of honesty. He'd failed. Not tactically. The Luftwaffe had dropped the bombs it was ordered to drop, but strategically he'd attacked the wrong enemy. You couldn't bomb a nation into surrender when the nation refused to believe surrender was possible. And that, more than any intelligence report or casualty figure, was the lesson of the Blitz. The lesson that would take 6 more years, millions more lives, and the destruction of Germany itself to fully learn. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, the fire burned low. And somewhere across the Channel, in the rubble-strewn streets of London, the British were already planning tomorrow.